However, I must add that there's almost a third dimension to it. So all organizations have stakeholders, whoever that stakeholder might be. If on the one hand, we're talking about resource optimization, so we know that resources are diminishing and we need to optimize them. And on the other hand, we're talking about value and benefits realization. We also have to talk about risk and how we manage risk and how we optimize risk, because regardless of what decisions we make, we need to be guided by what risk appetite we have.
Hello and welcome to the ERP Organizational Change Journal podcast, brought to you by Nestell & Associates. Nestell & Associates is an ERP organizational change management firm serving the private equity industry. I'm your co-host, Jonathan Donald, the founder of Invert Ventures, a change strategy firm, and I'm here with my friend and colleague, Dr. Jack Nestell, the founder of Nestell & Associates, and the host of the ERP Organizational Change Journal podcast. The ERP Organizational Change Journal seeks to share expertise, insight, and create effective conversation to help guide ERP organizational change to real, measurable, and verified success, expanding what we can see so we can act in a more effective way. We seek to promote, connect, and foster relationships in the ERP organizational change community. The primary purpose of this podcast is to discuss, share, and reflect upon effective and efficient ways in which to realize ERP organizational change success. We will discuss the people, process, and technological components of ERP organizational change. This podcast is intended as a forum to study, share, and discuss ERP organizational change. It's our intention for this to be a collaboration tool and resource. We hope that you find this podcast useful as we share lessons learned, discover best practices, and explore the human elements and components of ERP organizational change.
In this episode, we will discuss enterprise resource planning, history and evolution with Dr. Shadrack Katuu. Shadrack is a fellow research for the Department of Information Science at the University of South Africa. He joins us from Kenya today. This week, we will discuss Shadrack's paper, Enterprise Resource Planning, Past, Present, and Future. As Shadrack states in his paper, ERPs, or business systems, have experienced significant changes over the last 50 to 60 years. Understanding the history and a discussion of the evolution of ERPs provides insight into the ERP timelines and the presumption of improvement over time, and perhaps insight into where ERP systems are heading. Shadrack, thanks much for joining us today.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be part of this discussion. I feel very privileged to have been invited to come through, and we can examine the paper together from a very warm, we're supposed to have winter, but it's quite warm here in East Africa.
Well, thank you so much, Shadrack. As a friend and a colleague, I appreciate your work and looking forward to sharing this with our listeners. So thank you very much.
Excellent.
All right, Shadrack, let's dive in. So you mentioned in your paper, and again, this will be in our show notes, of course, for our listeners, but your paper was, you published that in 2020, Enterprise Resource Planning, Past, Present, and Future. And my first question, Shadrack, is in your paper, you state, actually in your abstract, that, quote, the purpose of this article is to provide a broad overview of the history and development of ERPs and outline recent developments with the advent of digital innovations like cloud computing. What motivated you to examine this topic?
Thank you very much. This probably will come out of a rather long explanation, but I'll make it quite brief. Post my graduate studies over the last 20 years, I've worked in a number of different organizations. My own background is not in ERPs, but in my discipline, we look at the management of records and information. And I noticed in working in different organizations, particularly the last 10 years in very large international organizations, that ERPs were increasingly being used to manage business processes and support ensuring that there's value to the organization. And in the information governance area where I work, we think very long term. So technology comes in, it's brought in, it changes the way an organization works. But for us who work with records and record keeping and archives management, we don't think 5 years or 10 years, we think 20, 30, 40, 100, even more than that. And so I thought to myself, well, once an ERP comes into our organization, what happens to all the other systems that existed pre that ERP? And that's what got me curious to look at, okay, so modern ERPs, whatever the brand we use, must have had prequels. And what were those prequels or prequel systems called? And so that informed the evolutionary investigation that I did. So I found out about MRPs, and I found out about inventory and management control systems, and went all the way back to the 1940s, and thought, well, if this is useful information for me and my working environment, I guess it would be for other people. Maybe I should write an article, and that's where the article came about. Written, a couple of years ago, and in the academic publishing process, usually it goes through a lot of peer review. So even though it came out in 2020, I think part of it started around 2018. So yeah, that's the background essentially, and the motivation.
Well, very interesting work, Shadrack. And, I think that the thing I find fascinating about your article, I think it does help us to really understand how technology going forward in ERP specifically can continue to bring value to organizations. And I think that's what we want to share with our audience, with our listeners today, is there's certainly some common themes, I think, with the history and evolution of ERPs in business systems in general. So very fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
So one question, Shadrack, we ask many of our guests this specific question because it's interesting to examine how fellow ERP practitioners and researchers respond. And so we'd like to ask you the same question. So obviously your study is on business systems and the evolution of ERP. So how would you define enterprise resource planning systems?
Right. So as with many other things, whenever one has to define things, it's almost in the eye of the beholder. You could have as many definitions as you have people. But one of the definitions I found quite interesting, and it's included in the article, is defining ERPs as both a concept and a system. In terms of concept, it involves the integration of business processes within the organization in order to manage a number of activities, order management, accurate information on inventory, improving workflow, standardizing best practice, and so on. So in terms of concept, and it's something I've seen also with the organization and what you've put out in many of the other discussions, it's around organizational change. So in terms of defining it as a concept, I would say it involves organizational change. But then on the other hand, you could view it as technological infrastructure, whether it is one application or a modular systems that have been put together depending on what is needed within an organization. So that's how I've seen it being defined in many of the sources I've looked at. One side as a concept, the other side as a system or technological infrastructure.
That's a great definition, Shadrack. I really like that. It's concept and system.
Right.
Very well said. I love that definition. I'm going to be sharing that again for sure. So, Shadrack, you also stated in your paper that quote-unquote constraints around modern ERP include really three main points, and I'd like to share those with our listeners. So the first point is implementation may require major changes in the company and its processes. And the second point is involves an ongoing, possibly never-ending process for implementation. And again, I'm quoting Shadrack here out of his work. And third, enterprise is limited with ongoing staffing problems. And when you look at those constraints, especially in the definition, in the context of the definition that you just provided, that ERP is not only a system, right? It's not just a technological system, it's a concept.
Mm-hmm.
In that context and with these constraints, are there any tactical or practical words of advice in terms of dealing with these constraints that you can offer to our listeners?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I guess there are a couple of things one could say. One would be to contextualize any introduction of a system or even a concept such as ERP within what I've also seen your organization mention, the three aspects of process, people, and technology. Mm-hmm. And to state that in a lot of our own organizations, usually the technology is pretty stable. The processes probably do need to be documented and documented well enough so that any changes that are expected with the introduction of new technology, it is clear that we don't have hidden processes taking place. And essentially for me, those two things should always be cognizant of the fact that we're dealing with individuals. So the people factor is usually, for me, at least the most complex, because change management and organizational change, when we are dealing with individuals who come from different places, most probably work in different disciplines, which have their own individual mandates and desires. So in very general terms, in organizations, the accountants would be wanting to do a couple of things that are quite different from, or maybe not different from auditors or engineers or right. Decision makers. So everybody has their own sets of needs, and the complexity usually comes in trying to direct individuals towards organizational change using a particular tool that is informed by specific processes. And I find, at least in the places that I have worked, that it's usually the people factor that determines whether you're successful or not, or the extent of your success over the long term. So, you could put in some change over the course of a few months or a few years when you have a particular group of people, and those people then move on, go somewhere else, and then you have a new group of people, and things like that essentially state, for me, what they state is we need to be cognizant of the fact that it's individuals who are involved and it's individuals who need to change. We're not just imposing technology and processes on non-existent infrastructure. We are imposing technology and processes on individuals who have their particular disciplinary needs. That's how I would put it.
Nice. I like that, Shadrack. And, I like how you said, well, you're dealing with individuals, right? It's an organizational event for sure. The time, money, and effort to implement a ERP successfully. And there are multiple stakeholder groups, but at the end of the day, you're dealing with people, you're dealing with human beings and individuals. And not only that, you also had mentioned, I believe to quote you in your answer, the people factor is most complex. And I think when you combine that, your response there with your definition again, that it's a concept and a system. So you're not just teaching the functional piece of a system, fingers to the keyboard, how to enter sales orders or how to do receipts or that sort of thing. A lot of times there's a lot there around the concept and, and getting everybody aligned on the concept and the value and what it can do for us and how it's supposed to work is a major part of the organizational learning process. Mm-hmm. And then in your second part there, part B, as far as your second constraint, you mentioned that it involves an ongoing, possibly never-ending process. That's so true because oftentimes when you implement an ERP system and you, as I call, hit the switch to go live, you can't always have everything right out of the gates. I think a lot of times that's unreasonable, unrealistic, and the reason that is sometimes implementing an ERP, there has to be method to the madness, so to speak, where you have to build that foundation first, right? You have to have solid and sound execution, transactional discipline, I will say, before you can layer on other pieces. Otherwise, you're just going to create more issues. But I think because of that, it really is. I mean, ERP systems are a tool for continuous improvement. They're that foundation in which to derive sound business intelligence, but it does take time, and it can take years of development and continuous improvement to get more and more ROI out of your system.
Yeah,
So,
just one additional comment I would say. So within the environment where we speak about people, process, and technology, in my information governance discipline, we've had an evolution of laws and regulations that are brought in at particular moments in time, which have an impact on organizations or enterprises. So, for instance, just because a system exists and people and processes have started working on that system, if a new regulation comes in within the industry, then there have to be changes based on that regulation because that enterprise has to be compliant. And so, as mentioned there, the ongoing, possibly never-ending process for implementation would mean that you have change requests on the system, change requests on the processes, and then go back to the people and say, hey, here's a new regulation. We need to change how we work. You need to change how you work. And this is what we're going to do to the process. This is what is going to happen to the technology. And this is what we are asking of you because we have a new regulation or we have a new law or things like that. So just adding that one other aspect where things come from outside the environment where the organization is and require organizational change.
Yeah, and that's a great point. Absolutely. You know, like you said, I mean, that can come in the form of regulation, state, local, federal, type of regulation, even customer requirements, right? Maybe you have a new customer and there's new requirements, or even maybe quality improvements. So
Right.
yeah, that's a really good point. There's lots of reasons why it's a never-ending process, not just for continuous improvement, really in terms of continuing to use the system to, make your internal processes more effective and more efficient. And there's always ways to do that, right? But then you're also just adjusting, and you have to be dynamic and sometimes innovative and creative in how you respond to regulation and customer and partner-driven requirements and quality improvement opportunities. So, yeah, great point. And really, actually, my next question, Shadrack, is kind of, I think, touches on that a little bit, the comment you just made about how business systems have adapted to that. As you describe in your paper, you said we went for, quote, inventory management and control, end quote, in the 1960s to MRP, hardware and software development in the 70s, to MRP2 in the 1980s, to ERP in the 1990s. And we'll discuss the 2000s and beyond in just a moment. But can you walk us through, maybe even just generally share with our listeners the primary purpose and constraints of each of these generations of ERPs, or if not necessarily ERPs, let's call them business systems.
Right.
But can you kind of walk our listeners through the differences and constraints throughout each generation? I thought this was very interesting in your paper.
Right. Yeah. I'll just do it very briefly because a number of sources have said different things about the systems. And just to think about it, I'd do it in parallel with what was happening with the technology and the technology evolution at the time. So in the 60s, even though my paper says the prequels to ERPs were from the 40s, most discussion comes out in the 60s when there was a lot of work with inventory management and control. And at that point, the organizations that had what are called inventory management and control systems, now it looks basic, but at the time it was revolutionary, batch and transaction jobs. And of course, they were using mainframe computers, which was what existed at the time. And then moving towards the 70s, you have production integration and planning. And you also have the birth of one of the biggest current ERP systems, SAP in Germany. And from the 70s to the 80s, you have what they call MRP, Material Requirements Planning Systems 1, and MRP, Material Requirements Planning System 2. The difference between the two is mostly about integrating or synchronizing materials with production. So in the 70s, it was more about production, what was going on within production and production integration. And then in the 80s, it was synchronizing what inputs you bring into production and then bringing in the sales and accounting mechanisms. So that's 70s and 80s. What are defined as ERPs are mostly seen in the 90s. Of course, there are some that existed late 80s, like the birth of PeopleSoft in 87. But these are defined mostly in the 90s. And then you have what are integrating enterprise functions that go beyond just production and material management to other functions. So essentially, that's basically what was going on. From the mainframe computers to personal computers of the 80s, of course, the invention of the internet in the 70s, and then in the 90s to what is now known as the World Wide Web.
Right. And Shadrack, I thought it was interesting. I read hundreds and hundreds of ERP research papers and articles and books. And I thought it was interesting that you went back to the 40s. You actually mentioned, the 40s in your paper. And that's true. Technically, there were quote unquote business systems, right? And there was an evolution. And most people in their articles, they start in the 90s. Most of the research papers, you look at the definition of ERP. Of course, when ERP, that term was coined, is the 90s. So a lot of the research begins there. But it's just fascinating to me when you do look back that far back and you look at the evolution and the different constraints and the purposes that we went through these different generations of systems is quite fascinating.
Yeah. So one of the things that got me going back beyond the 90s is I've worked for a number of international organizations. We would call them, sort of the United Nations family of institutions. And without mentioning which ones precisely, a lot of these organizations had computing technology or computing power from the 60s. And part of my responsibility in terms of record keeping, and especially record keeping of digital information, was what do we do with content that was generated in the late 60s or the 70s? That does not work within the current ERP system, but exists in pre-existing systems. And so, informed by my own practical experience, I thought, if I'm going to write an article about this, I need to be thinking way before what we call ERPs, to looking at systems that pre-existed these ERPs. And as we saw from our research, some of the ERP manufacturers like SAP, were formed back in those days.
Very interesting. Great point. And so, Shadrack, let's just talk a little bit more about the 2000s. In the 2000s, the computing world saw the advent of, as you know, cloud computing, for instance. As you explained in your paper, and you'd mentioned, according to Gartner, actually, let me share the quote. Quote, according to Gartner, the ERP market has been undergoing a generational technology shift driven by the advent of cloud computing. Cloud-based ERPs emerged by the mid-2000s due to the perceived benefits of moving away from managing on-premise ERPs, particularly in managing upgrades and maintenance processes. While most cloud ERPs are provided to the customer as a software as a service, a number of PaaS are also common. So, platform as a service. Shadrack, can you explain for our listeners what is the difference between software as a service and platform as a service?
Okay. That's a great point. I'll do one step back and then move towards that without going into too much detail. So what we saw in the 90s in terms of ERPs are integrated functions that brought in financials and procurement and marketing and project management into the ERP system. And in the 2000s, you have an expansion of those modules to include human capital management, to asset management, quality assurance, warehouse management. And a lot of these systems were on-premise, especially earlier on in the 2000s. They were on-premise because that's where we were technologically in terms of what was happening. But as we saw cloud computing coming in, and I'll use cloud computing as defined by the U.S. National Institute of Standards and Technology, it's a model for enabling ubiquitous, convenient, on-demand network access to a shared pool of configurable computing resources. So we're talking network, servers, storage, applications, and services. So that's what the US NIST defines cloud computing. So once we saw this come in, a lot of the software vendors thought, hey, why are we limiting ourselves to systems that are only on premise? Can we leverage what cloud computing brings in to see if we can expand usage? For instance, what happens when you have modules where people are in the field and they're wanting to do something like sales or marketing, and they want to check into the system. Life was a little more complicated in the 2000s. For those of us who are old enough to remember then, I'm trying to use my mobile device. I'm trying to log into the system to see, what sales activities I need to be doing. So the vendors go, can we create or deliver software applications through a thin client interface so that users don't have to worry on their devices to manage underlying infrastructure? So essentially, software as a service is delivering software applications on a thin client interface without an application, all that infrastructure that needs to sit on your device for you to be able to have access. So that's software as a service. In terms of platform as a service, this is middleware that is used by developers to build and configure SaaS applications. Back in 2000, at the time, I'm now in Kenya, but at the time I was working in Canada, and for a short period of time, I worked for a software company that developed and sold software for managing archival material. And I recall having to have discussions with clients who would say, well, we have the web now. Why are we having to download all this heavy infrastructure onto individual computers? Can't we use the web to make sure that there's a lot of agility around how we use your software? And we were at the time, and we're talking about maybe end of 2000.
Sure.
We're at the time where we were moving towards that environment that would bring cloud computing, that would bring these infrastructure innovations in SaaS and PaaS and so on. So it was a struggle back then. It doesn't look like it was from now. From where we stand at the moment. But back then, it was a great innovation, I would say.
Yeah. Yeah, very interesting. And you wonder, as you'd mentioned, as you're describing that process and the difference between software as a service and platform as a service, really what we're talking at the end of the day is just different ideas of business systems, whether it's technology-based or functional-based. And, what was once called MRP, then MRP2, and then the phrase ERP got coined. In my mind, I've wondered, what's it going to be called next, right? In 2030s, is it not going to be ERP? Is it going to be called something else? Or is there going to be some other word that we use? But, I think at the end of the day, it really, as you said, when I think of ERP, and that's what we call it because I think it's just easy. It's, it's really business systems. It's just a way, and sometimes that may include, of course, technically enterprise resource planning. There's other solutions out there like warehouse management, right?
Right.
And, these other acronyms for all these other software functionality, but it all kind of gets rolled into ERP. So in the context of ERP research and implementing ERP, it kind of rolls everything into this bucket of just really business systems. Is that a fair way to think about ERP?
I believe it is at this point. I know that there is always some tension depending on where people are coming from. So some people would say, we manage customer information, so our systems are not ERPs, they're CRMs. And then some people would say, no, we do supply chain and our systems are SCMs and not ERPs.
Yeah.
But I'm happy to go with the overall ERP tag because in any case, it's a recent innovation because other systems were called something else in the past. And what I've seen, especially going forward, is we had ERP and they were called ERP1 by Gartner. And then we had extended ERPs, and now we're moving towards postmodern ERPs. And so
exactly.
It's interesting. And, people are putting a question mark on what will they be called in the 2020s. We've just started.
Exactly. And so actually I have a follow-up question for you there.
Right.
So you state in your paper, Shadrack, that, quote, in the mid-2010s, previous iterations of ERPs were loosely coupled solutions. And I think that's kind of where I was headed. It's loosely coupled solutions of these CRMs or whatever other acronyms and functional packages, right? And then you go on to say, therefore, Gardner coined a new term of, as you just mentioned, Shadrack, postmodern ERPs that were seen as a more agile and outward facing. Shadrack, can you further explain or describe for our listeners what that means to be a postmodern ERP?
Right. I guess that the term postmodern is, depending on what field or discipline one comes from, especially outside the technology world, can be quite controversial. But the way I see it, as has been defined by Gartner and other experts in the field, is if you look at, and I've mentioned this just briefly a few moments ago, if you look at what ERPs were before, at least the 90s and 2000s, a lot of them were on-premise and there were limitations to that. And if you move off-premise and you start using cloud computing, then you are going outside what was considered standard or what was considered usual.
Yeah.
You also have a very traditional architecture around the previous ERPs with presentation layers and application layers and communication platforms and databases, relational databases. So a lot of these things were pretty stable in one environment where you have a bunch of servers and you can have you can all look at them and say, okay, so everything is here. We can all see it. In this, what is considered a postmodern world, you have a federated architecture that might not even be sitting in one place. So it's probably sitting in different places. And what was happening at the same time in terms of technology environment is we're moving towards a lot of things not being in one place, not even being in one jurisdiction in a sense. So things become a lot more complex. And I guess that might have been one of the reasons that informed Gartner to think about ERPs as being a bit postmodern. So that's my sense of it.
Got it. Yeah, just so fascinating to me. Shadrack, I think in your article, which obviously you know how much I appreciate your article, there's not a lot of articles that discuss these trends and evolution. Obviously, they're there. There are great articles that talk about this, but I just really thought yours was quite interesting, the way you've approached the discussion. But can you share with our listeners, and I think this is really one of my favorite takeaways of your work, that is the idea of the value-driven evolution of ERP. And you had mentioned that it's prompted by at least two related realities. Can you just summarize for us and maybe articulate what those two realities are?
Okay. All right. So one of the things that our organizations are facing a lot these days, a lot more, I would say, is that we are constantly faced with diminishing resources. So we don't have enough resources to get everything done. But there's also increased pressure for us to provide quality and quantity products or services, depending on what you're doing. So I haven't worked too long in private enterprises. Most of my experience has been in what we call the public sector, governmental or intergovernmental, multi-governmental organizations like the UN. And I would say in both environments, we definitely do not have enough resources to get things done, and we are under pressure to provide quality and quantity products or services, depending on what the organization needs to do. At least that's what I documented in my article. However, I must add that there's almost a third dimension to it. So what we have, all our organizations have stakeholders, whoever that stakeholder might be. If on the one hand, we're talking about resource optimization, so we know that resources are diminishing and we need to optimize them. And on the other hand, we're talking about value and benefits realization. We also have to talk about risk and how we manage risk and how we optimize risk, because regardless of what decisions we make, we need to be guided by what risk appetite we have. So in a sense, going beyond just what was written in the article, there are three realities that we have to work around. One is how we optimize the resources that we have, which are limited. The other is what value we're getting out of whatever activities are taking place within our organization, and I'd call this benefits realization. But the third, which was not mentioned in the article, is the idea of risk optimization.
The other thing too is one of the kind of the value-driven evolution is part of that due to digital innovations, robotic process automation and artificial intelligence. Is that part of the reason is just ERPs are also keeping up to the technology that's not necessarily developed specifically in the context of ERP?
Indeed. And so that's a useful point to make. And this is why I added the third aspect. So when we talk about, for instance, artificial intelligence, this is an innovation that has been with us since the 1950s. And I'm part of a research group right now that is looking at artificial intelligence again. It's been with us since the 1950s, and there are various categories of brands of artificial intelligence which currently exist that were different from what existed several decades ago. Now, in the ERP world, and I don't necessarily talk about this in this article, I do in a separate article. In the ERP world, as soon as we're asking an algorithm to start making decisions, we need to be thinking about responsibility and accountability if those decisions then have to be questioned. And that's part of why I added the issue of risk and, also looking at compliance and regulation. If an algorithm in an ERP is going to make a decision that has an impact on product services or even ethics of an enterprise, then we have to start asking ourselves the question, is this digital innovation something we live with within our enterprise or not? And that's the concept of risk and risk optimization that I was bringing in, that is not in the article, but what, pointing out.
I see. Yeah. Very cool stuff. So, Shadrack, one good reason to understand the past is to help shed light on where we are going, right?
Right.
And so that being said, where do you see ERP in the 2030s and beyond? If you got it, get your crystal ball out for a second. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so that's the $50 million question, right? And if I could answer that question, I think I'll retire very comfortably and do endless safaris in Kenya, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So, but a number of people have been talking about, different generations of ERPs and where they're going and what they need to be doing. 2030s, I guess, would be too far-fetched. We don't know what's going to happen in the next 2 to 5 years. But I would say, as one of the authors who I quote in the article, we are moving, the focus is more away from control to value, as we discussed right now around benefits realization and the 3 aspects of what institutions need to be thinking about. The question then becomes, how are organizations just going beyond keeping the lights on and making sure that we follow procedures and move with the regulation? Can we start appealing to our customers, to our citizens, if it's a private enterprise, citizens, if it's in the public sector, governmental or intergovernmental, and ensure that we are meeting whatever their needs are. And this is the aspect of value that I'm talking about. I know in the past, many organizations usually had IT goals that were, we need to control this. We need to ensure that it follows this procedure. We need to ensure that it follows this process, and people need to do this very efficiently. So that's the control aspect to it. But because organizations live within an environment that's much larger than just themselves, we need to be thinking beyond just control into the value aspect of things. That's how I would put it.
Got it. So, well, first of all, Shadrack, this conversation has been really fun, and we'll definitely have you back on the show because I think there's a lot more to talk about here and just some really cool stuff I want to share with our listeners from your work. Last question here for today. Your article, and you mentioned a couple of these very briefly, but your article concludes with 2 observations made from your work in reviewing the evolution of ERP. Can you summarize for our listeners What were those observations?
So I would say the first is this transformation aspect where ERPs are moving from a focus on control to value. That would be the one quick aspect that I've just discussed. And then the second is the evolutionary changes within ERPs are built on the presumption that each iteration sought to improve internal processes within the enterprise in which the ERPs were implemented. So that's the presumption we find in terms of looking at this in an evolutionary manner.
Yeah. Well, that's really interesting. And so, Shadrack, thank you for your time. And I want our listeners to know you did write another article, and we are going to have you back on just to discuss this article as well. The name of the article, and we'll include this in our show notes, but it's Trends in the Enterprise Resource Planning Market Landscape. So we'd love to have you back on to discuss that article as well. Shadrack, thank you so much for your time today, your expertise, your work. I really want to share that with our listeners. So keep up the good work.
Thank you very much for having me. And this has been a great discussion.
Likewise. Thank you again. Be well, Shadrack.
All right.
And we'll reach out to you here soon because we need to get you back on to continue this conversation.
I'm happy to join you. Thanks.
Listeners, thank you for joining us on today's episode. We are incredibly excited and grateful to have friends, colleagues, and mentors join us on our podcast. We have an incredible lineup of guests, including ERP and organizational change speakers, authors, professors, researchers, pioneers in the field, practitioners, PE partners, business executives, ERP vendors, and organizational stakeholders. We invite you to leave us feedback and a review because we want to make this the most useful and insightful podcast you listen to, and we need your help to do so.
Thank you, listeners, for being with us again this week as we seek to, 1, promote, connect, and foster relationships in the ERP organizational change community, 2, contribute to the field of ERP organizational change, and 3, bring research and practice closer together. Please join us again next week as we discuss the latest ERP organizational change research, practice, and stories. Our podcast will draw on knowledge from extensive research, collaborative learning, and practitioner expertise and experience.
From everyone here on the team, Jack and myself, we wish you a great week, and we hope to see you again soon on another episode.
Hashtag the ERP Organizational Change Journal. Have a fantastic week.
Bye for now.